of the Liri Valley in central Italy, perched on a rocky hilltop that commands the landscape for miles in every direction, stands one of the most sacred sites in Western Christianity, the Abbey of Monte Cassino. Founded in the year 529 by Saint Benedict of Nursia, had survived for nearly 1,500 years as a beacon of learning, faith, and culture. Through barbarian invasions, through the Dark Ages, through medieval conflicts and Renaissance intrigue, the monastery endured. Its library preserved ancient texts, its scriptorium copied manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost to history. Its bells rang out across the valley, marking the hours of prayer for generations of monks who dedicated their lives to God within those ancient walls. But in the winter of 1944, Monte Cassino became something else entirely. It became a fortress, or at least appeared to be one. It became an obstacle in the path of armies. It became a symbol of military necessity confronting cultural preservation. And ultimately, it became the target of one of the most controversial bombing raids of World War II, an action that would reduce centuries of history to rubble in a matter of hours, and spark debates that continue to this day about the fog of war, the protection of cultural heritage, and the terrible choices commanders must make when lives hang in the balance. This is the story of the Battle of Monte Cassino, a 4-month struggle that consumed 4 separate Allied offensives, cost tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, and culminated in the destruction of one of Europe's most treasured landmarks. It is a story of courage and sacrifice, of strategic miscalculation and desperate fighting. It is a story of Polish soldiers who fought for a homeland they might never see again, of New Zealand infantrymen far from home, of Indian sepoys and French colonial troops, of German paratroopers who defended every inch of ground with fanatical determination. And at the center of it all stood the monastery, ancient and immovable, looking down on the carnage below. The strategic situation, gateway to Rome. To understand why Monte Cassino became so important, we must first understand the strategic situation facing the Allies in Italy during the winter of 1943 and 1944. The Allied invasion of mainland Italy had begun in September 1943, with British and American forces crossing the Strait of Messina from Sicily and landing at Salerno. The campaign had been sold to the public as a way to knock Italy out of the war and open a gateway into Hitler's fortress Europe, relieving pressure on the Eastern Front and paving the way for the eventual cross-channel invasion of France. The reality proved far more difficult than the planners had anticipated. Italy's geography favored the defender at every turn. The spine of the Apennine Mountains runs down the center of the Italian peninsula like a backbone, creating natural defensive positions and limiting the routes of advance for mechanized armies. Rivers run west from the mountains to the sea, creating additional obstacles. And the narrow width of the peninsula meant there was little room for the Allies to exploit their superiority in armor and mobility. This was going to be an infantryman's war, fought ridge by ridge, river by river, against an enemy who had every intention of making the Allies pay in blood for every mile of advance. The German commander in Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, was one of the Wehrmacht's most capable officers. While some in the German High Command had argued for abandoning southern and central Italy and establishing a defensive line across the north, Kesselring convinced Hitler that Italy could be defended much farther south. He would trade space for time, conducting a fighting withdrawal that would delay the Allied advance, consume their resources, and prevent them from moving forces to other theaters. Most importantly, he would create a series of defensive lines across the narrowest part of the peninsula, forcing the Allies to attack fortified positions under the worst possible conditions. The most formidable of these defensive lines was the Gustav Line, which stretched across Italy roughly 75 miles south of Rome.
The Germans had spent months fortifying this position, building bunkers, laying minefields, registering artillery coordinates, and creating interlocking fields of fire that would turn any assault into a killing ground. The western anchor of the Gustav Line was the Tyrrhenian Sea. The eastern anchor was the Adriatic, and in the center, dominating the only practical route of advance up the Liri Valley toward Rome, stood Monte Cassino. The mountain itself rises about 1,700 feet above the valley floor, a massive limestone outcrop that provides observation over the entire surrounding area. From the monastery at its summit, observers could see for miles in every direction. Highway 6, the main route from Naples to Rome, ran directly below the mountain, threading through the town of Cassino at its base before entering the Liri Valley. The Rapido River, swollen with winter rains, provided an additional obstacle just below Cassino. To the north of the monastery, a series of ridges and peaks continued the defensive line across to the Adriatic side of the peninsula. Any attack up the Liri Valley would be conducted under direct observation from Monte Cassino. Artillery spotters on the mountain could direct fire with devastating accuracy. Machine gun positions on the slopes could sweep the valley floor. The town of Cassino itself had been turned into a fortress, with buildings converted into strong points and every street prepared for defense. And behind the Gustav Line, Kesselring had additional defensive positions prepared in depth so that even if the Allies broke through, they would face another costly battle before reaching Rome. For the Allied commanders, the situation was frustrating beyond measure. They had the men, the tanks, the aircraft, the artillery. They had superiority in every measurable category of military power, but none of that seemed to matter against the mountains, the mud, the rivers, and the German defenders who had turned central Italy into a fortress. As 1943 turned into 1944, the advance had stalled completely along the Gustav Line. The campaign that was supposed to be a swift march to Rome had become a bloody stalemate. Something had to give, and the focus of Allied efforts increasingly turned toward that mountain crowned by its ancient monastery.
The First Battle, January 1944. The first attempt to break through the Gustav Line and take Monte Cassino began on January 17, 1944, as part of a coordinated offensive that included the amphibious landing at Anzio, 50 miles to the north. The strategic concept was sound in theory. While the British X Corps attacked across the Garigliano River near the coast and the U.S. II Corps assaulted the Rapido River below Cassino, the landing at Anzio would threaten Rome from the rear, forcing the Germans to either withdraw from the Gustav Line or risk being cut off. At least, that was the plan. The reality bore no resemblance to the neat arrows drawn on the planning maps. The British X Corps managed to establish a bridgehead across the Garigliano River, but their advance quickly bogged down in the face of fierce German resistance. The American assault on the Rapido was nothing short of a disaster. The 36th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit from Texas, was ordered to cross the river in the face of dug-in German defenders who had every crossing site registered for artillery fire. The attack began on the night of January 20th, and by the time it was called off 2 days later, the division had suffered over 2,000 casualties with nothing to show for it. Men drowned in the cold waters of the river, weighed down by their equipment. Others were cut down by machine gun fire as they tried to cross on footbridges or in assault boats. Those who made it across found themselves isolated and unable to advance, eventually forced to withdraw back across the river or be captured. The commander of the 36th Division, Major General Fred Walker, had protested the attack before it was launched, arguing that it was suicidal to assault a well-defended river line without adequate preparation or support. He was overruled by the Corps commander, and the attack went ahead as planned. In the aftermath, there were calls for investigations and questions about who was responsible for the debacle, but none of that brought back the Texas soldiers who died in the freezing waters of the Rapido. Meanwhile, at Anzio, the landing had achieved complete tactical surprise, but the Allied commander chose to consolidate his beachhead rather than push immediately inland toward Rome. This gave Kesselring time to rush reinforcements to contain the landing, and what should have been a dagger pointed at the heart of German defenses became instead another static battle, with the Allied forces trapped on their beachhead and fighting for survival.
With the attacks on the flanks having failed to achieve a breakthrough, attention turned to Monte Cassino itself. If the mountain could be taken, if observation could be denied to the Germans, perhaps the entire Gustav line would unravel. The task was given to the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, another National Guard unit, this one drawn from Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. These were farm boys and small-town Americans who found themselves fighting in one of the most difficult tactical situations imaginable. The assault began on January 24th, with the division attacking toward the town of Cassino and the slopes of the mountain above it. The fighting was immediately brutal. Every building in the town had to be cleared, often in hand-to-hand combat. Every yard gained on the mountain was contested. The Germans had prepared their positions carefully, using caves and crevices in the limestone rock to create strong points that were nearly impervious to artillery fire. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Minefields channeled attackers into killing zones, and all the while German artillery and mortars rained down on the advancing Americans. The soldiers of the 34th Division pushed forward with extraordinary determination. They captured the railroad station at the edge of town. They fought their way up the lower slopes of the mountain. Small groups of men, sometimes just a squad or platoon, would capture a German position after hours of fighting, only to face immediate counterattack. The winter weather added to their misery, with cold rain turning the battlefield into a sea of mud. Supply parties carrying ammunition and rations up the mountain were hit by German fire. Wounded men had to be carried back down steep slopes under fire, a process that could take hours. By early February, the 34th Division had managed to establish positions on several of the hills surrounding Monte Cassino, but they could not advance further. The division had been fought to exhaustion. Battalions that had started the battle with nearly 1,000 men were down to a few hundred effectives. The German defenders, primarily paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, had proven to be tough, skilled, and determined opponents. Every position had to be taken by direct assault, and the Germans counterattacked repeatedly to regain lost ground. In early February, after 3 weeks of continuous fighting, the First Battle of Monte Cassino ended in failure. The 34th Division was pulled out of the line, having suffered over 2,000 casualties. The Gustav line remained intact. The Germans still held the town of Cassino and the mountain above it. And now, as Allied commanders contemplated their next move, attention increasingly focused on the monastery itself. Was it occupied by German troops? Were they using it as an observation post or even as a strong point? And if so, what should be done about it?
The monastery and the controversy. The Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino was not just another building. It represented 15 centuries of Christian history and culture. Saint Benedict had chosen this mountain for his monastery because of its commanding position and its remoteness from the distractions of the world. Here he had written his famous rule, the set of guidelines for monastic life that became the foundation for Western monasticism. From Monte Cassino, Benedictine monks had spread throughout Europe, establishing monasteries that became centers of learning during the Dark Ages, preserving classical texts and advancing agriculture, education, and the arts. The monastery had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. Lombards had sacked it in the 6th century. Saracens had destroyed it in the 9th. An earthquake had damaged it in the 14th. But each time it had been rebuilt, and by the 20th century it stood as a magnificent Baroque structure, with ornate churches, extensive libraries, and priceless artworks. The library alone contained over 40,000 volumes, including ancient manuscripts that existed nowhere else on Earth. When the war came to Italy, the Vatican and the Italian art establishment had worked to protect the monastery's treasures. In the fall of 1943, with the front lines approaching, German officers had actually cooperated in evacuating much of the monastery's artwork and library holdings to safety. Trucks had carried crates of manuscripts, paintings, and precious objects to Rome, where they were stored for safekeeping. The German involved in this evacuation, Lieutenant Colonel Julius Schlegel, saw it as his duty to protect European culture from the ravages of war.
The irony would not be lost on historians that Germans helped save the monastery's treasures even as other Germans would soon be accused of occupying it. But not everything could be evacuated, and the monastery buildings themselves remained, along with a small community of monks who refused to abandon their home. The abbot, Gregorio di Amare, was an elderly man who had lived at Monte Cassino for decades.